Just a reference.
When you work out for 3 hours every morning. I did run out of time. What's your academic ranking? You have school as well?
No, I want to do it.
Mine is in administration, and then
yeah, we did family that back at that time. We connected to the natural
that's great.
But now that he's been pretty tight.
Yeah, you can see sticking. Yeah,
It was my guess.
Have you done any posters running into each other now? Abstract? Yeah. You don't need it for instruction.
And wait a second. You're research.
I like the catfish. It's funny, the one that
I think so. But it should be on your side. All the three.
Assistant professor.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else to follow on, right?
Are you guys outside? Yeah. Do anything?
Did you guys want to say something before we get back into
And so,
Yeah, we'll just transition from the break now.
so I do that
Tell them who you are, your bio, and then you guys tell them what they need to know.
all that stuff counts.
And then you're good with just handing everything out, or do you want me to do any of that?
It's just the two of us.
Okay. One day.
I have some.
One day we'll do it.
I have some.
When we're not like in the pressure. Well, Andre, I am so sorry about that. Whatever happened there.
No, it hit my
That's so weird.
It's a freaking thing. So I'm sitting there and I put it in my binder, and I guess it hit the metal. No, that's fine. I'll just take it, either get the screen fixed or get.
Hopefully the glasses start falling off.
Yeah, I was gonna see if I could find some tape or something, so at least I can get shards of glass. It's always weird doing something. Because if you mess up.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll against you for the rest of your day. We'll queue it up and let you know.
After my phone updates, I will, one of our breaks, I'll send you my CV so you can see. But it'll give you ideas of things you can put in there. And I actually have records too. Yeah, this is a so think about this. Yeah, I know.
Back here, do you have the first piece
That's what we were planning anyway, no formal planning.
Okay, we need to get started. You gonna close the door? All right, so we're going to transition into our next segment on inclusive leadership, and I am thrilled to have Lord Lee, who's the director of ODI, partners with Dr. Sharon Page, and Andre Koen, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, who recently joined us, and really thrilled to have him here with us. This is going to be an exciting and engaging session, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you.
Well, thank you for no pressure. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, and this is an honor to be here. Both Andre and I have been here for less than a year, and so it's a wonderful opportunity with a group such as this. So, my name is Lore, but that wasn't quite my given name. Right? So, are you familiar with the Hmong community, Hmong culture? So, after the third day of birth, you usually do a naming ceremony. Well, my name, the original name that was given to me, was the wrong one. How do we know? Because I rejected it. I rejected it because I became real ill. Okay? And in the culture, because I became real ill, we brought in a shaman to do a healing ceremony. And in that healing ceremony, we found out that my name, the given name, was the wrong name. Okay? Don't ask me what my original name was, I do not remember. So, in that, he renamed me Lore, which, if you know anything about the Hmong community, is also a surname for a clan. Okay? And it is the clan in which his spirits, his shaman spirits, came from. So it's an attempt to protect me.
My name is Andre Koen. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, and my mother won the coin toss in naming me. And so her father's name was Bert, and I did not look like a Bert when I was born, and so she went for his middle name, which was Andrew, and the idea of calling me Andy was not something that she was very fond of. And so she dropped the W from his middle name, and I am Andre Koen. And so that's how I got my name.
So why do we start a session like this with sharing our names? Well, you all have been talking about this idea of leadership, right? And Andre and I, in preparation for this conversation, also talked about authenticity, which I've heard you all talk about a lot this morning, but also yesterday in the session with Paula. And this other piece of this inclusive leadership is being vulnerable. Showing up in vulnerable ways, right? So we are not perfect. You heard that from Paula yesterday. We are not perfect. We cannot be like someone else. So in inclusive leadership, how do we show up in authentic ways and also being vulnerable to the people that we meet? And so because of that, this session, we're going to cover a lot of things, and I won't read all this to you. We're covering high-level things around diversity inclusion, giving you kind of the foundation around that. But also, we're getting into inclusive leadership and the 6 traits of inclusive leadership as put up by the Deloitte model. Giving you some tools to reflect on your own journey to this point, and helping you build kind of a plan to move forward. And exploring, a lot of this is about exploring the community. Okay? And how do you impact the rest of the team members?
Yeah. We're also not going to give you any checklists. We don't have a formula, but we will give you a set of principles that you can use that will thrust and empower your leadership. And so we'll be focusing a lot on principles that you can apply, because it's funny, I taught middle school, and so whatever you have to toss at me, I can handle. But the interesting thing about teaching in middle school was when I had rules, when I was a teacher, and this is a difference that I want you to kind of pick up on, and if you can get the nuance, when I was a teacher, I had rules in my classroom. And when I was a teacher and I had rules in my classroom, what did my students spend most of their time doing with those rules? Either breaking them or trying to find loopholes, right? But when I became an educator, I had principles in my classroom. And so when I had principles, it wasn't about breaking them, it was how do you live up to them, and then what is your responsibility to the community when you don't live up to those principles. And so hopefully we can help you, and I think the DRIVE program is a big part of that, shift some of that thinking from being the person who has to do it, but to being the person who creates the atmosphere where it gets done, right?
So, a little bit about the diversity inclusion work at Mayo. On your left, you see the high-level D&I vision and mission. On the right side is a visual depiction of the 6 high-level goals of diversity inclusion across the enterprise. And in a nutshell, what I would say is there are 3 goals that are focused on patient care and outcomes, and there are 3 that are focused on the workforce. Okay, and how do we improve the workforce? Whether that's both your representation and working through the diversity and inclusion side, but also the inclusive environment piece. And some of you might have seen this before, and I won't spend too much time here, but you'll see the kind of the infrastructure to support all of this work. Okay, the big purple box all the way on the left, thank you, Hannah, is our office. But we aren't alone in doing this work, right? And so all the way on your bottom right-hand side there, all the smaller orange boxes are also offices within different shields that do this work, right? So you have the Office of Disparities Research and Office of Research Diversity and Inclusion in research. You have in practice, led by Dr. John Knudsen, the Office of Health Equity and Inclusion. And in the education side, led by Dr. Yageda and Barbara, the Office for Diversity, focused on the students. Okay? And again, we don't do this in isolation. There's individuals across the organization that are doing this work. And we also have, through the work, diversity department leaders. That's where a lot of the work actually gets done at the department level. Okay? And also our employee resource groups, where many of you have probably heard of them or are part of. They also are driving some of the change, not just from an activities perspective, but also driving practice and policy change. Okay. Oops. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the infrastructure to support the work here at Mayo. But we are here to talk about diversity and inclusion, right? So how do you all define diversity? So uniqueness, okay? No right or wrong answer. Variety.
Diversity of thought, diversity of experience.
Okay, experience, thought, perfect. Great. All right, so I'm going to show you a video of another gentleman's perception of diversity, his idea of diversity, and then we'll come back to define it.
In addition, a lot of you have been hearing the affiliates complaining about a lack of diversity on the news team. What in the hell's diversity?
Well, I could be wrong, but I believe diversity is an old wooden ship that was used during the Civil War era.
Ron, I would be surprised if the affiliates were concerned about the lack of an old wooden ship.
Nice try, right? We're not concerned about an old wooden ship. That's not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about, you guys named some of this, some of the differences, but also the uniqueness, the similarities that we bring, each one of us brings to the table as male employees, as male employees. Okay? And so, as we think about it, here's all of us in the middle, right in the middle. The first dimension of diversity are pieces about ourselves that we have less control over, that we are born with, or born into, right? Even though age changes every year, we can't control that part. Think about things like ethnicity or race. Those are things we were born into or created by society in some cases. The second dimension of diversity are pieces that we do have more control over. Right? So think about religion. How many of you were born or have known people, or you yourself, have changed religious beliefs throughout the lifetime? Think about education. Besides myself and Andre, how many of you were born into education? We chose over time, did we not? So, all these things, we have choice. The last layer are pieces about the workplace, right? So even within Mayo, we have multiple subcultures. Even within, the example I use often is, even within nursing, right? You take someone, a nurse in the ED and a nurse on one of the floors. Two very different approaches to work. Okay. outside of Mayo, outside of healthcare, people think, oh, nurses all do the same thing. You're a nurse, you're a nurse. It's not the way it works. So even within Mayo, we have multiple subcultures. Beginning from this group. So here in Mayo, we define it as the unique differences, or the differences and the similarities that we all bring. Okay? And as you can see, it goes beyond race, beyond ethnicity, beyond gender. Each one of us brings African roots. And so with that, the I part, right? Inclusion. Inclusion really is about creating an environment where people can perform to their full potential. Given all that diversity, everything that we come into the workplace with, do we have an environment where we can perform to our full potential, that we are engaged, that we can, I heard you talking this morning really about shifting your energy, right? What do I prioritize my energy today? Right? So, do we have that type of environment? We all can create that type of environment.
Lord, can you go back to the slide?
Yeah.
So when we talk about this idea of inclusion, and we talk about this idea of generating that energy, if I had to select one of these not to bring to work, can I be my authentic self? Can I bring my energy, my 100% energy level, my creativity, my all of myself into the workplace to deliver excellent service if I have to pick and choose which parts of these I can and cannot contribute in that workplace? And so when we talk about inclusion, it's about bringing your whole self into this space.
All right, so that's how we define diversity and inclusion. And what is the difference? On the left-hand side, you see the kind of the definition of it, or what diversity is about. Diversity is about counting the numbers in the room, right? Men, women, race, ethnicity, ability level, veterans, you name it, all the pieces that we collect from HR. It's also about, we define it as unique differences and similarities. Inclusion is making sure that everyone has an equal value, that everyone is sought out to have a voice, right? And all the way at the bottom, you see you receive an invitation to the party. Andre and I are newly joining the Mayo party, right? But the task of the organization is creating an environment where we are asked to dance, and we are part of the community that selects the music. We are part of the community that selects the food, the decor, you name it, right? So that's how we can distinguish kind of the difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is numbers. Inclusion is creating the environment where all of us can thrive. So why diversity and inclusion here at Mayo? Lots of different factors. Even on the board behind Andre, I wasn't here for that, but I can kind of guess that you were talking about internal, external factors, right? All right. So you see similarly up here, and I think you covered some of those pieces in your conversation yesterday too, is some external, internal factors that are driving some of this work here at Mayo. The red are pieces that we will focus on a little bit of our time on to help you think about what are those changes or what are those factors that are driving some of the changes in the needs here at Mayo on diversity. Okay. So you probably already are familiar with this projection, right? That over 50, or by 2050, over half of Americans will be made up of individuals of color. And let me take a step back and say that even though we define diversity really broadly, going back to the data that we can collect, mostly around race, gender, ethnicity, loosely veterans and disability, right, from an HR perspective. So that's what we're going to be able to share with you this morning. Again, this is nothing new to many of us. You've probably seen this projection by multiple years ago. But if you think about the states that we live in, or that we operate in, right? It's happening in Minnesota, a place like Minnesota. Well, 1 out of 5 Minnesotans already identify as a person of color. And 5 times the growth rate when you look at the residents of color in the state of Minnesota. Okay? And your fastest growing group are your Hispanic students, even in your rural areas. And how many of you think, yeah, it's happening mostly in urban core? Not, right? Minneapolis, St. Paul obviously makes up a large portion. If you look at a little bit deeper, southern Minnesota, where most of our health systems colleagues are, right? Dearborn, Rochester, Austin, and a little place called Wilmington, Minnesota.
And an important thing to think about in contrast to the conversation we had about government, the health systems, if you look at these numbers, provide a number of diversity opportunities for us. And so the leading edge suggests that there should be some interactions that we can learn from those health systems that can actually influence the rest of the system, the other parts of our organization on the cutting edge, so to speak. And so that's something that we should note here as a part of this presentation.
I don't have the same slide for Arizona, Florida, but I can tell you that for the Latino population, you're at about 3 out of 4, right? And so you have a much higher population here in Arizona and Florida.
Why are they moving to Minnesota?
Why?
Yeah, I mean,
So in a place like Worthington, it's farming the southern portions, but also in a place like Worthington, there's meatpacking.
oh, really?
And as part of that, if we look at the patterns of migration for immigrants, no matter where the immigrants are coming from, is usually the first wave is the most academically affluent. The second wave is typically kind of the working class or the foreign class, and so they come into low, high labor, low wage, entry-level jobs in meatpacking plants or repetitive industries are typically kind of where that's their entry into the working class in the United States. And that goes back, I mean, you can look at Italians, you can look at the Irish, you can look at Latinx folks, Hispanic, Latino folks today. That migration pattern has typically been pretty traditional for incoming communities. Yes. Yeah. Someone has to make the spam.
I love spam. We do acknowledge that on our literature, because we're required to run demographic information for all one by one for a lot of the literature around the care preparedness and policy. So long as it's in the top, and you'd be surprised too, I don't know what I rattle all of them. About 20 languages across all the sites, but they're inconsistent with the ranges that we.
Place like Austin's 25,000 people, there's 53 languages.
So again, in small places like Austin, this diversity is coming. You guys talked about that as external factor, right? But it's also happening right within our walls. Okay? Happening right within our walls. And so I'm going to keep talking a little bit about this external factor piece and focusing on Minnesota because that's where a lot of the data that I have right now. But even with if you think about that workforce as a whole, this isn't just about healthcare, but as a whole, if not for population of color, using population, we're actually losing. Okay? We actually losing. And even with those populations, in different regions of Minnesota, we're still negative. Okay? So now you think about healthcare. You identified healthcare workforce shortages up there on your board. And I think about specialized care in each of those areas. Fastest growing population in your population per color. Right? We're seeing that high shortage. Less of them are coming into healthcare. What's going to be the problem moving forward?
A lot of white people.
What's that?
A lot of white people.
Well, taking care of themselves. Right? And so I think that's part of our challenge as we think about why is diversity improving things from a workforce perspective. sustainable if we don't build that pipeline up. So, what does Mayo's diversity look like? Have you all had access, chance to look at some of this work? All right. So enterprise-wide, patients of color make up about 14% of the whole enterprise. So, but if you look at the different population, it's not very different.
So, and also, I do want to point out clarity of language, particularly at this level of leadership, that people of color includes all people who consider themselves to be people of color, so the pigment hue and whatever. However, the term used by the government would be minority. And so sometimes people try to use those interchangeably, when in fact some people who have a pigment hue that one might say you are of color may in fact not be noted by the government as being a minority. So so just we'll have more time to talk.
We'll also add in their URM.
Yep.
Because I know that there are some restricted education folks in here. So URMs as well.
Yep, so URMs are awesome. And so we'll do some coaching about how to differentiate those things. But I didn't want you to walk away not at least thinking about the difference between a person of color and a so-called minority or a URM. So underrepresented.
What's a URM?
Yep, an underrepresented minority. And so an educational, so I did, yeah.
Yeah,
so.
and part of it, so for usually whites and Asians are taken out. And so you're looking at your Black, African American, Latino, Hispanic, Native American, Indian, usually the population.
In URM.
Yes.
Right. So a minority would be anyone who is not Hispanic or white. And then white has a category, but we'll give you some information on how to differentiate those things. But I did not want it to describe. No problem.
It is a source of confusion for many groups that we've talked about. And so going into kind of a little bit deeper, the physician scientist population, you see that if you look all the way back to 2000 to 2017, you have incremental gains in both your women or female up on top and then minority down the bottom. And similarly, if we break it down across the health system or across the enterprise, we see that breakdown. And we'll send you all this, so don't try to capture all this data. And similarly on the allied health side, you have this data, but it's pretty stagnant when you look at that female thing. Again, across the enterprise, I won't spend too much time there, and then you'll get it. But through all that, right? So I show you all that data, I give you all that background about why this program, diversity, inclusion, and Mayo Clinic. And so Kathy talked a little bit, and Josh talked about the board of governors and the committees, and so this has been, we talked about going through the board of governors and committees. We've probably gone through 2 different PCCs, board of governors, board of trustees, with different iterations of this. And so this group is kind of one of the first groups that we're kind of shopping this with outside of that leadership, those leadership teams, to really think about and share with you some of the things as leaders we're going to be focused on across the enterprise and workforce diversity. Okay? And so all the way on the left, you see improve the representation of underrepresented individuals at all levels of the organization, create an inclusive environment and transparent communication. What you will see, that's where we're really going to be focused on, is increasing women and minorities in leadership and succession pools, decrease diversity in health, allied health, and the new hires, increase retention, because what we have seen in the past is in 2017 there was about a 10% difference between employees of color who leave in the first year and white. One of the explanations is the Morrison transition, right? But even if we take that year out, we go back a couple of years, there's still a 3 to 5% gap.
Thank you, Mark, for that. And if we were to look back at this slide that you had before that had residence fellows, does our pie slice shrink of either women or minorities in students, fellows, residents, then going to, looking at staff? So if we're looking at position scientist staff, could we also attribute that to those would be identical?
Yeah, I think that
Or is
those
that
are
a
all
stretch?
things that we're looking at
Okay.
right now, is how many of these folks actually get, or stay on,
Yeah.
right? And how much effort do we actually put into keeping kids straight? Other questions? All right, and so again, you see, we'll make this available to you. There's a lot of busy slides up there, but stuff up there, but those are where we have some real metrics behind it. There's some real work to analyze data and seeing and have some real assumptions about, especially that top of the house, 200 leadership level or 200 leadership roles, both on the allied health and the physician side, assuming that there will be almost 100% turnover within that physician leadership ranks. What is the effort we need to put into growing that succession pool so that they are ready? And if they're not ready, what is it that they need? What academic advancement are they? We're seeing gap there, right? Therefore, physician women leaders, their academic productivity doesn't come until about year 29 of service here and there, right? For men, it's about year 25, right? And so they go like this, year 29. So what do we need to do? We roll that back or think differently about leadership roles. So all those things are important, out the conversation. So that's why we are here to talk about your role as leaders to advance in this world. Right? And so we're offering this idea of these 6 traits of an inclusive leader, and they're built around this the Deloitte model, where you talk of, and we're going to start with this cognizance piece in a little bit, understanding you as a leader, where you come from, where you are along your journey. And then we'll move into the curiosity to the right, curiosity, cultural intelligence, collaboration, and throughout the session, we'll build it around these 6. Okay?
So what is our genus and species? Yes. Oh, they should be right. It's on the table. Yeah, they should all be on the table. Yeah. Yep. So our genus and species is what?
Homo sapiens.
Homo sapiens. Is that it? Genus and species. We are Homo sapiens. I heard it. No. Homo sapiens sapiens. We are Homo sapiens sapiens. Why is that important to recognize that we are Homo sapiens sapiens? Homo meaning same, right? Sapien being
We're failing you.
I'm sorry. And also, it's an open book test, so Google is available to you. No, so the idea is that we're Homo sapiens sapiens. We're the enlightened ones. We eat knowledge, right? So many of you have devices by a company that has an apple. You know why the apple is not a complete apple? Because you took a bite out of knowledge, right? So we eat knowledge, right? Homo sapiens sapiens. So the biggest part of our responsibility as humans is to be thoughtful and to think about our thinking, right? So when we talk about these 6 traits, one of the first is recognizing that we need to be thoughtful about how we think, right? So using metacognition, thinking about thinking. Next is this idea that we need to be curious. So once I have explored my own thoughts, how am I now curious about others? What is suggested by the word curiosity? What concepts are kind of embedded in this idea, this concept of curiosity? Yes.
That you don't know everything.
That you don't know everything.
You're seeking more.
That you're seeking more.
Something new.
That there may be something new out there. Right? That you're open to new opportunities, right? So as a leader, it's important for us to think about our thinking, to be curious, to be open, to seek new things. And I would say that part of our humanness is really about seeking and exploring. I do find it interesting when I hear people say, I am 100% ... When in fact we know that human beings have traveled all over the planet and they left more than pots, right? So that's always interesting to me. And then there's this idea of cultural intelligence. And so when we think about cultural intelligence, there's a particular way that I want you to kind of lean into that. And that's not that you have to know everything about every culture, but you have to be aware of what you know and what you don't know. That's intelligence, right? So when we talk about this idea of cultural intelligence, because not everyone is the same, and so there is a difference between a stereotype and a generalization, right? Or an archetype and a stereotype. But knowing the nuances of those commonalities and differences is actually what makes you culturally intelligent. And then lastly is this idea of collaboration. So how do we, what is a compromise?
Trade-off.
It's a trade-off. And when do compromises fail? When it doesn't seem fair, right? So you enter into a relationship. To enter this relationship, I had to give up my motorcycle. She had to give up her knitting. At some point, I might come to the conclusion that that was not a fair trade. So a compromise, oftentimes, is what's at the root of that particular kind of compromise? Equity is at the root of that. So it's equal for me to give up my motorcycle and she just gives up her knitting. Yeah. Resentment. Resentment is at the root of all compromise. Resentment. And when it appears again to be unequally balanced, then that seed of resentment grows, right? And then before you know it, you get all kinds of explosions. But collaboration says that I'm not giving up anything and you're not giving up anything, but we will build something together. So you can crochet on the back of my motorcycle, right? That's our collaboration, right? Or you knit a saddle from, anyway. Then there's this idea of commitment. So what do we agree to do? So now that we're building these things, what are the norms and nuances of how we will relate to one another as we continue to build this thing? And lastly is this idea of courage. And courage is, anyone served in the military? Anyone have family members that served in the military at some point, right? In talking with those family members who served in the military, were they ever afraid of their assignments? Yes. Did they do their assignments? Yes. What gave them the ability to be courageous in doing an assignment that they were afraid of? So the mission was more important than their fear. What else? So a sense of duty. What else? Training, right? So they practice and practice and practice. And so even though I may be afraid of these things, I can practice to know how to overcome my fear to do that. What was another thing that they had? They had their team, their brothers, their sisters. They had resources. And so when we think about this idea of courage, it is not just blindly going into a situation and saying, I am courageous. No, it's actually recognizing that I practice, I have resources around me, I have a network of people who will support me, and therefore I can be courageous in taking this stance because I have a good platform. Right? And so when we talk about those things, that's important. And so four things I want you to just think about for yourself. You don't have to answer these, but I want you to think about these. Is how do these align with organizational values, right? So so respect, integrity, compassion, healing, teamwork, innovation, excellence, and stewardship. Are those manifested in these 6 categories? And I would suggest that they are, right? That they're specific, that they're embedded in that. And so what kind of evidence can you provide that suggests that these things are embedded in our male culture, given our DNA, right, our values? Does anyone have any examples of how any of these can be demonstrated as a part of our culture? Yes.
Our triad leadership model.